You know, next week, it will have been 7 years since the hate crimes committed at Mother Emanuel. And that seems like a long time ago. It does. But we've had constant reminders along the way, including the killing of George Floyd, the victims in Buffalo recently, that we've still got a long way to go. And it is the forum's purpose to get us there as a community and as a model for the nation. And that's why we bring people together. We try to bring different perspectives and forge solutions out of that common understanding of ways we can move forward together. And the forum, as you may know, focuses on 4 social pillars, really: education, economics, policing and criminal justice, and what we're here for tonight, what we call the future of the past. And what's interesting is, you know, our surveys have revealed, in the past couple of years, you may have seen the surveys are available on our fancy new website for you to review. You can get everyone to agree on goals for education, for treating people fairly by law enforcement. You can agree on all of these goals in these areas, but what really still is a division are these issues that seem less practical, but certainly more emotional of a divide for our society, and that is these issues of the future of the past. And so we want to bring everyone together and have an understanding of why only 36 people in the Tri-County area think that our government is handling controversial statues and monuments the correct way. And we want to find out ways to get there to where we can all appreciate that all reasonable people in the Low Country believe that we're handling it the right way, at least in an acceptable way. And we couldn't have better guides for our journey to find the correct way to do things than our panelists tonight. One quick mention, our second panel of public officials will have 2 faces with us who aren't in your program, but who should be familiar to you. Councilman and Reverend Kylon Middleton will step into one spot. 2 people couldn't be with us because of personal issues. And City Councilman Ross Appel will be here in the other spot. And we certainly, you can understand that they are not only good public officials because they're ready and willing to do this, but they're engaged enough to be able to do that on short notice. So thanks to them for rounding out our second panel tonight. But starting with the first panel, I'd like them to come join me on stage, if you would. Moderator extraordinaire for the forum, John Simpkins, who is heading the MDC currently, which is creating an economic and equitable infrastructure across the South. Next to him, we have Dr. Walter Edgar, whom everyone I'm sure knows as a preeminent historian of South Carolina, but not only that, one of the first founding trustees of the International African American Museum, which of course is a nice segue over to Dr. Tonya Matthews, who is steering our International African American Museum to educate the world about these issues starting in January of this coming year. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Blain Roberts back with us, a Charleston Forum alum, and the co-author of the award-winning book on these very issues about our very community called Denmark Vesey's Garden. And down at the end, we have Mike Allen, who is an award-winning historian with the National Park Service, who has dedicated so many years to these very issues in our community. And I thank them so much for joining us. John, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everybody. As a former YPDer, I can tell you I'm very happy to be here in Morris Brown AME Church, even with a little bit of feedback. And it's going to be a pleasure to lead you all through a conversation today where we're going to be talking about public history, how we remember the past, which past we choose to remember, and what choices do we make in doing so. And I'm going to allow my colleagues up here on the panel to introduce themselves in one way by responding to probably the easiest question you'll get today, which is, How do you enter this conversation about public history in the Low Country and in South Carolina? Where are you as you enter this conversation? Dr. Edgar.
As of right now, how I've tried to deal with it over the past 40 years. It's been an evolving process, both with me personally and obviously with communities and certainly with historical organizations as they make, whether we're talking about a Middleton Place or the South Carolina Historical Society, things have changed and changed rather dramatically. My late friend Charles Joyner, one of the state's great historians, and I have a note, I want to make sure I get him his quotation correct. In 1994, Chaz said, speaking of South Carolina as a community, I know that we have come a long way since 1960. Now, for some of y'all, that may be ancient history, but for those of us born in the 40s, it was not ancient history. We've come a long way. Some have dragged their feet all the way, but they have come. Some say there's been no progress, but they have forgotten where we started. Some would stop here, for they cannot see how far we still have to go. And what my friend Chaz said in 1994, I think is still true today. We did start somewhere a long time ago. We have come a way, but we still have a way to go.
So I think for me, I come to this in an interesting way, even though I am now stewarding the International African American Museum as its CEO. Most days I feel as if I'm coming into the space as a member of the general public. My background is in engineering. My liberal arts lean is into poetry, and so I come into this space on sort of a constant and continual learning curve, and now I'm jumping into this space, as I have been as a public historian, but I do still have that fascination with these stories, that surprise or chagrin that I'm just hearing the stories, the amazement that other people don't know the story. And thinking about, to your point, what should be the inspiration behind talking about how far we have come. I think one of the reasons we resist that conversation is because of the fear that someone will say, far enough. And so I think that gets in the way with the fact that if we've come this far, clearly whatever is ahead on the journey is something we have been prepared for. And I think that what we're also seeing are the shadows of an unreckoning or a non-reckoning. If you do not reckon with the past, with these stories, you may be moving along, but you are still dragging some stuff behind with you. And apparently it has wheels and a motor. So it will catch up to wherever you are, I think eventually. And so as I think about public history, which is about how to apply history to modern questions and conversations, I'm always struck at how much easier some of the conversations I find myself in would be if we already knew the earlier story. And then what does it take to give people a space for what I call a courageous curiosity, to admit what is unknown, to slow down, go back, pick it up just a little bit, and then have a conversation about what happened last week or last month or 7 years ago.
Hi, I'm Blain Roberts, and I lived here in Charleston from 2005 to 2007. And so I kind of come into this conversation as a non-native Charlestonian who was here, and I was troubled. We went on a lot of tours of Charleston when we lived here, my husband and I, he's over there in the audience. And we were very disturbed by some of the things that we heard on these historical tours that we went on when we were here. We did not hear much about the Black experience. at all. We didn't hear anything about slavery or segregation. We heard nothing about African American accomplishments. And so the two of us became very interested in why the tourism industry developed the way that it did. So I think my perspective then comes from deciding to figure out how that happened, why that happened, and immersing myself in the historical archives really for the better part of a decade all over town. The South Carolina Historical Society, the special collections at the College of Charleston, the Avery Research Center, and really digging through the records to figure out why certain Charlestonians were only telling part of the story and ignoring a really significant part of the city's history. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, an effort to really understand the deep history of the narratives that emerged in Charleston. So.
My name is Michael Allen, and I'm retired from the National Park Service. And to your question, ironically, 42 years ago this very week, I began my journey with the National Park Service, of all places in our American experience, Fort Sumter. That first week or two of actually being there, in many respects, sort of put me on the pathway for me sitting here this afternoon. Why will I say that? Because within the first week or two of me working at this transitional place in American experience, I was peppered with such questions as, why are you here? And what do you as a person of color or a black man have to do with the story of Fort Sumter and the American Civil War? And beyond that, perhaps what version of the Civil War will you be telling us? So as a youngster, 42 years ago, I had to digest that. But one day while walking through Fort Sumter, I said, well, maybe I should walk through here as a tourist, not as an employee. So the first thing I did is I went into, as you all would do, into the gift shop. And I began looking in the gift shop at the various titles and books that were being presented and sold to the traveling public. And as you said, Blain, I did not see myself in the bookshop. So the next thing I did, I walked and took a look around in the museum. I mean, that's where we go to get the information of where we are. Well, again, I did not see myself in the museum. Then a little piece in my head said, well, this museum was built in 1961. You probably won't. Then I began to listen to my fellow employees sharing the story and the journey of the site as well, and I was not in their narratives. So 42 years ago, I came to this conclusion. Either I was out of place, working at this transitional place in American history, or the agency, which I worked for 37 and a half years, the National Park Service, perhaps was out of touch. I did not believe that I was out of place. So from those conversations 42 years ago, and the journey that I have been on and have worked with many of you all sitting in this audience, in many respects, I can say perhaps have changed the narrative in some way. Now, does that mean that we have reached the promised land? No, but I believe today that we're in a better place in our interpretation than when I stepped on that dusty soil, rock area of Fort Sumter, because I can look here and see Dr. Matthews as the director of the International African American Museum, and realizing some of the conversation I had to have 42 years ago allows her to sit here today. We all, if you did not know, are sitting in the Gullah Geechee Culture Heritage Corridor, which stretches all the way from Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida. Perhaps didn't have conversations 42 years ago, that would not be a reality. So I come at this from a personal perspective of my experience, the opportunities, and the partnerships and the relationships that have allowed me to be a part of this change, but yet I believe we still have a few miles yet to go.
Thank you for that bookend comment, Mr. Allen, because you referenced Dr. Edgar's earlier comments about when he quoted Chaz Joyner about how far we've come and how far we still need to go. And in hearing all four of you respond to that broad question, the notion of narrative and the creation of narrative, who tells the story, certainly came out in your responses, as well as both the way that narrative is processed individually and collectively. We have our stories. Sometimes there are stories that we tell each other individually, and then sometimes there are the stories that we tell collectively. All of this to say that history is contested. The past is contested. How do we accurately and comprehensively and completely grapple with our past when there's no consensus on what that past is? And this is a question for anyone who chooses to jump in, not any particular person.
There is no consensus. And I was thinking, first of all, Michael didn't mention the Reconstruction National Park, which is rare in this world. Almost in North Carolina just appropriated $16 million for a Reconstruction National Park. We've got the park, but we don't have $16 million for it. And I heard Blain say, sometimes presentations are made, whether it's at Middleton Place or Colonial Williamsburg, explaining the lives of African Americans or BIPOC, whichever term you choose to use. And sometimes from white listeners, that's not what they want to hear. Tourists probably, and I don't want to mischaracterize anything, probably like Gone with the Wind history better than they do what really happened. Blain, you looking at me like, because we've had this experience at Williamsburg. The oldest school for African Americans in the country is at Colonial Williamsburg. Why are you all doing this? That's what our interpreters just said. Why are you doing this? We want to hear Patrick Henry in the House of Burgesses.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's a historian at the University of Mississippi who wrote an article about this, and the title of the article was, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen, but does anybody want to hear about them when they're on vacation?" And I think that kind of gets to the core of the problem. I do think it's actually the case that for much of the 20th century, many tourists wanted to avoid these hard questions that we're talking about and these hard issues. But I've been somewhat encouraged over the last couple of years. I think that the traveling public is much more aware and much more interested than they were previously. And there are a couple of good examples here in Charleston that I think that would illustrate that. One would be Mcleod Plantation, which some of you may have been to. It is an outstanding historical site that centers the experiences of the enslaved. You don't even go in the big house. And of course, that type of tour would have been unimaginable, even I think 20 years ago in Charleston. And so I think that has changed. A similar site in Louisiana would be the Whitney Plantation. Some of you may have been there. It takes a very kind of similar approach. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we are changing what people are able to handle when they are traveling.
So let me throw in sort of a potentially alternative perspective to that, because I'm curious if that's one of the stories that we told ourselves to allow us to get away with the stories that we were telling. Right? You still have to know somebody who knows somebody to get into the new African American History and Culture Museum at the Smithsonian, right? And at this point, we all know you got that first floor and a half. You're going to take a lot of deep breaths and, and rub a lot of shoulders. We have, of course, Brian Stevenson's project down in Alabama. We do have these things. And so what we're looking at is we're looking at places like our historic sites, such as our plantations or Civil War sites. They are growing into a new story and finding that the audience is already there. And so I want to be careful around thinking that it's just sort of a matter of time. While I do think some audiences are coming to a space where they are ready and do want to hear that, I think the other part of it was these were simply not audiences that folks wanted to talk to. And I'm not, just talking about our classic tourist population. If I think about my background and my family, we're African American. We're really not trying to go to the big house and hear about how great the big house was. That was not quite the tour we were looking for. And that audience, I think, has always been there. And so the way I think about this time is using it to help us balance the actual reality that if tourism is your main, one of your main industries, there was a fear. Well, if we change the story, will people still come? Now that we know people will still come when you change the story, that kind of takes that off the table. But what I think I see happening now is I see indications that people will not come if you don't change the story. What I'm noticing is this sort of search for gentle spaces where I can curiously explore something that I probably should have known. I'm starting to see some pushback on places that are interpreting in a way which it has become, I think, more broadly known, that either that's not a correct interpretation or it's not the only interpretation. And so they're asking, and I think at the museum we start to get that. People are asking us for references of which plantation tour should we go to. And if they're asking the International African American Museum, there's an implicit question in there, okay, which of these folks is gonna get me sort of closer to the truth? And so I think there's something that we can do with that.
Follow up with a question related to that, Dr. Matthews. Is there now, or at least an emerging industry that is catering to those people who are curious and come to you for those recommendations that you can send them to?
Yes, but probably not at the speed we need it to, right? I think that there is a lot more interest. There's also a lot more interest of diverse presentations at non-diverse sites, for lack of kind of a better phrase for that. They're not expecting to see white folk in white folk place and black folk in black folk place and brown folk in brown. They're actually, I think, expecting to see some kind of mix. And so I think navigating that has been interesting, and I think I'm also starting to just see, I think history is as much a product of the time it's told in as of what happened in that space. And so I'm starting to see, rather I'm starting to work to figure out how to cultivate an openness to understanding that there are different narratives, right? We're not here to pick your narrative for you, but I think that there is incredible power in understanding that there are multiple narratives around a particular conversation.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask or share this to what you said, Tonya. I can remember when, because I've been around as long as I have, the historic sites were uncomfortable. Even in having the conversation, and myself and others had to share with them that we were in this together. So if someone comes to your particular plantation site in Mount Pleasant on Long Point Road, without naming it, and you have a bad experience there, they are going to assume that that's the same narrative that's going to happen if you went to one of the three up on Highway 61. And so I think one of the first things we had to cultivate in the mind of leaders at these historic sites that we are in this together. We may not have all of the answers at our park. You may not have all the answers at your site or whatever, but collectively, in a collaborative move, this can help us, as we say, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so I think that became a part of the shift that I think that leaders at various historic sites really believed in and tried to work more diligently to be more inclusive, to be more holistic, to be more diverse, and to really look at their stories. Because for some of them, this was very hard. And there was a conference that we did with the cause of Charleston a number of years ago behind the big house. And then one of the things we talked about is the hoop skirt experiences at these historic sites. And yes, many Americans are looking for hoop skirt experiences, but that's not where we are in 2022. And so we have to really push the narrative that we're in this together.
Yeah, and if I could just add real quick, in talking about diversifying the experience that somebody like a tourist might get, I think Charleston's done a lot of things wrong in terms of forging and disseminating these narratives, but I don't know if you remember this, Michael, we interviewed you for our book a long time ago, and one of the things that one of the things that you told us is that as you were doing all this really hard work with the National Park Service, that you were concerned that some of the historical sites around town, that because they hadn't yet started telling different stories, that they might undermine what you were doing because they were not giving accurate history. And so you reached out to these sites and said, let's start working together so that we can make sure that we're all telling a truthful, accurate story. And I think that's really important. Similarly, I think it's important to recognize that there were a number of African American entrepreneurs in Charleston who said, we don't like what we're hearing on these carriage tours, and so they started their own tour companies. Alfonso Brown, of course, with Gullah Tours was a really important early forerunner in that. Robert and Aleda Small also, they started a company called Living History Tours. And I think that they deserve a lot of credit for taking this on themselves, taking the risk to do that, and they've played a major role in changing the stories that tourists hear.
Is there any effort to promote others who would want to get into the tourism industry, who want to tell those stories, who want to set up the businesses that you can then refer people to?
So I think that's one of the things that we're working with a lot of partners, and to the point just made, folks are very, I think, separated, right? So here and there. The nice thing about Charleston is it's not a town of secrets, it's a town of whispers, so just sit still. And you'll find out kind of what you need to know. And so I think that there is a lot to be said, that there's some, but there's not quite enough. And then often when you have sort of entrepreneurs and the smaller businesses, they're not in that broad network of listening, right? And so if you think, hey, I'm coming to Charleston, I'm gonna do an Airbnb, that's a whole level of infrastructure, right? And so you're like, all right, these things just pop up, I'll just pick 3 of these, and this is what we'll do. We're gonna boat, we'll eat some rice, and sort of those kinds of things. And so I think that there is work that we can do around our infrastructure as a municipality from a big picture standpoint about thinking about how our infrastructure elevates and emphasizes or de-emphasizes, certain folks, certain communities, sort of based on, I think, the size of the business or the capacity and what's required to support, those kinds of businesses and things like that. So, for example, actually, just in the mail today, I got my copy of the South Carolina Green Book. Right, so this is a bigger project which sort of claimed the spirit of the traditional Green Book, and now it's an encyclopedia of African American historic heritage sites all across the state. So there is a variety, okay? There's everything from if you park your car right here to the left of that oak tree, you can take 20 steps to the left and don't look up because you'll miss it. It's right there on the ground type sites versus, well, there's the, 100,000 plus square foot museum right there on the water. And so thinking about how we as a community ourselves navigate and nurture these sites, and then also how our tourists navigate those sites, I think becomes its own kind of thing. And the last thing I wanted to say around sort of diversity, the storyteller matters. And while this is really good because we're diversifying the story, we're telling the truth and having these kinds of things, even if you go to our friends over at Mcleod, they will tell you, based on who's telling the story, the reaction from everything from acceptance to pushback to hostility is different based on who is telling the story. And so we have to think about that to the point that we're all in this together. You've got to be self-aware in terms of how your colleagues are being received. But there are also pros to that as well. There's some weightier parts of the African American journey that I can tell because it's part of my experience and I can own it, and it's kind of a, if I'm okay, you're gonna be okay, kind of this. And so I think there's a lot to be said about this mix and mingle that we have in our storytellers.
I was just going to add to, when you talked from the business perspective, I guess from my eyes, from a local perspective, the Convention and Visitors Bureau in many respects is a gatekeeper to entry into the tourism relationships. And I guess I've been fortunate enough to be engaged with them at least for the last quarter century in terms of helping them to see their place in terms of how we expand the narrative. And then also from a state perspective, PRT, Park Recreation Tourism, because they manage tourism for the entire state of South Carolina. But PRT and the Convention and Visitors Bureau may not be kitchen table conversations. So people may not have any knowledge of these two entities, but these two entities really control the narrative of how tourism or tourists are informed of our existence, the opportunities that we have here, where you can sleep, where you can eat, where you can go. And so it's incumbent upon us in our relationships with the Convention and Visitors Bureau as well as PRT to continue to remind them that they are here to serve all South Carolinians or all folks here of the Low Country.
Well, while we're speaking of local organizations here, I think I need to put in, not a plug, but what South Carolina ETV has done over the last 30 years has done an awful lot to change perceptions, whether it's Gullah Gullah Island or sacred spaces. And the shows, people keep asking for those. And there are now a lot of them are podcasts, and so we know that the hits are coming from a very diverse audience. But that's has been, I think, a powerful changer, and certainly in terms of being able to teach. So I just, as we're dealing with public history, it's more than just the historic site.
And that raises a bigger question, Dr. Edgar, that I want to get into. Bobby Donaldson at USC's Center for Civil Rights History and Research, he's building something there, literally, physically, on the former campus of Booker T. Washington High School. What is happening across the state to tell that more complete, complex story? How are historians talking to each other about these issues?
Well, those of us who teach South Carolina history are a very rare breed these days. Quite frankly, those of us who are talking are an older generation. I think of Vernon Burton, my friend up at Clemson. One of the bright young stars of, I think, South Carolina and American history is Brent Morris, who until recently was at USC Beaufort. He's now going to be at Clemson. You didn't know? He's going to Clemson. He's a former student of mine. I'm delighted. But seriously, when Chaz Joyner made that quotation, there was someone teaching South Carolina history at every institution of this in this state. Interestingly, it's still taught at Claflin. It's still, well, until Bill Hine retired, it was still taught at SC State. So we do have a problem because some folks deal with, they say, we're dealing with broader issues, the world. They're forgetting about the community that they are supposed to be serving.
And I think you bring up a really good point, something that the field, history and public history both need to grapple with, which is that if you were interested in this space but thought you would not be allowed to tell the truth in that space, that would not necessarily be the degree that you want, right? If you're thinking, I'm going to try to write this, from this perspective, tell this story, and my tenure committee is just going to knock it down.
So you're talking about other gatekeepers now.
Right, the ultimate gatekeeper in terms of that, and that is something we really need to grapple with. quickly, because in the day and age, as you said, of podcast and of create your own broadcast, while I'm still a personal fan of academia and that kind of rigor, it is not required to get the story out. And so I think we need to think about that and grapple with, if you want younger folks who are coming up in this generation who are all about unearthing the truth, and like any 20-year-old, making a 65-year-old mad is like part of the mission. And so you're thinking about being in this space. We do have to think about, where is our next generation of historians and public historians going to come from? How do we motivate them? How do we, support them to uncover additional truths with the same level of rigor that we would require in that setting?
I just wonder, what does that look like in a country in which various approaches to teaching history are under attack? And not to speak of it in the context of what's being taught in colleges and universities, but what's being taught K through 12, when there has been this notion that, well, these attitudes will die out with succeeding generations. But what we've seen all too clearly, even here in this city, is that young people get radicalized by a version of history. The hard thing here to me is, how do we get to the people who are coming up through our public school system, who are in the K through 12 system, whether it's public or private, a version of history that is complex and comprehensive?
I wish I had an answer for that. I'm not being, because a while back, when they redid the history curriculum back in the 90s, A.V. Huff from Furman and I served on that committee. And the people who teach, I feel for them, because what the State Department of Education puts out, that they've got to teach, and students have got to pass, some of them have to pass this course, and quite frankly, dealing with something as local as what might happen here, although you can connect anything in South Carolina to a national issue. I mean, that's not, our history is that important. It's that easy. But teachers are, I think they're stressed. I really worry about, I worried about it 20 years ago. I really worry about it now as to what is being taught. There never seems to be enough time in the day to do what has to be done. It's probably not, it's not unique to South Carolina, but for those of us who, deal with teachers, it's, maybe y'all have got a better idea.
I do not have an answer to that very difficult question. But I think that one of the interesting things that's kind of implicit in everything that's been said so far is that, public history as a category, sometimes I like to jettison the category or complicate it a little bit, because I think the most important public history practitioners that we have are our teachers. Anytime you walk into a classroom, whether it's a college classroom or a K through 12 classroom, and you're teaching history or social studies, however it's labeled, you are engaging in, I think, the most important form of public history, and that is conveying in a way that your students will understand these important truths about the past. And so I think it's important that our teachers feel that they're public historians. And I agree with you that we are in an incredibly difficult moment, and I have to say that being in a university with tenure, I operate in a very different environment, and I feel empowered to say anything that I want to say. And if I were a public history teacher in a state that had recently passed an anti-CRT law, critical race theory law, I would be very cautious, I imagine, about some of the things that I would say, and that is a really, really horrible place to be in. So I don't have an answer except to say that I think that we probably need to focus a lot more of our political energies on our local school board races and city council races, and that's probably how we're going to start to solve that problem.
And then, in terms of connecting with the teachers, this is another responsibility I shared as well with other folks at historic sites. Kids come to your class, to your historic site as a field trip. They need to know before they leave that building that they're coming for educational experience. This is just not a day out of class.
Right.
First thing. And so that's why I when I was engaged and involved, tried to have partnership relationships with the school system and the school and the teachers before they actually stepped on the property. Because if you didn't have that relationship first, it's already an accident when they arrived at your property. Yeah. And I think having those relationships, as I remember, with teachers, it gave them a sense of trust, it gave them a sense of confidence, and it gave them a sense of awareness of where they actually were going, and then they would use those type of, I guess, feelings to really empower the kids to know that we really are going to a transitional place in American history, Fort Sumter. This is not just a boat ride along the Cooper River.
Right.
And I think, you know, for me, and this has become such an important and critical, I think, hot topic, I may be seeming to go left, but I'm here. As we come to the conclusion of the Jurassic Park era, we are all thinking about that original line, life always finds a way. And we are now at a stage where that can be said for truth and for story. So remember when we thought that the way to, sorry for this group right here in the front, the way to keep our kids away from errant sexual activity was not to tell them about it, and how did that work out for us? Not well at all, right? And so the idea is that our students are engaging with these stories. Do we want them to engage with those stories alone? Do we want them to engage with those stories without someone who can walk them through it? And I will say that our secret weapon here is that we have now moved from rote memorization as a best practice to critical thinking, right? The idea is it's not, school was probably never, but definitely is not about indoctrinating children. It's about giving them information and examples, and then you got to critically think your way through, which frankly is far scarier than a student that will simply memorize and spew out whatever you'd like to tell them. And so as the daughter of an educator who gets reminded regularly that teachers need to be in charge of their own classrooms, I think this is what I think. I think that in this world of radical access to information, our students, even our adult neighbors, are being exposed to all of this information and these confirmations. And I've never met anyone who was angry at discovering the truth, but I meet people daily who are angry at discovering the truth was hidden from them, and that's the reaction that I'm seeing a lot. And so I think that's what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about our students. They are engaging in these conversations, they are engaging in these stories, and I think it is a dereliction of duty for us to not give them the tools, the guidance, the educators, the museums, the historical sites, the books, the whatever it is, to be able to explore that space, a little bit of safety, a whole lot of confidence, and some experimentation in their early steps into their own critical thinking.
In another life, I worked with countries that were writing constitutions. And in Liberia, something really interesting happened. When Liberia decided to reimagine and reconsider its relationship to the United States, one of the first things they did was they created a commission to look at history and the history that had been received in the country. The goal there was repair. Is the goal of public history repair here?
Interesting question. Repair, reform, edit.
All of the above?
I think
Yeah.
all of the above, in order that we can retell.
The R's seem to have it for sure, because I am on a reckoning, reconcile, and retell. Sort of in terms of that, I think one of the things we simply haven't done is we haven't reconciled dealt with these things. And so we've got commissions to celebrate history, right, and to do our commemorations, but we actually don't often have commissions to explore and interrogate the history. And so, yeah, hope springs eternal on that one.
Well, maybe we stop thinking of history as a celebration. I think that's been part of the issue, is to celebrate this.
Right.
And I can remember when they were doing the Civil War sesquicentennial. They were going to celebrate the Civil War, and Chaz Joyner said, "Why do you want to talk about something that killed 40,000 young men from South Carolina, 600,000 Americans? What is the celebration about?" It's like somebody wishing a veteran Happy Memorial's Day, which, by the way, they do on TV. Just, it's not. History is not pleasant. I mean, history was made by human beings, and we know from the beginning of time. Human beings make mistakes. Human beings can also change, and I might want to use that as a segue as we tackle the other part of public history that everybody seems to have dodged on this panel. The
He just hasn't asked the
third
question
rail,
yet.
or is it the third statue? I'm not sure. People do change, and trying to do a nuanced reading of why this plaque is there, why that statue's there. And by the way, I did read the whole report of the city, and I still don't know how many memorials, monuments, or how the city of Charleston defines that. It certainly covers literally the waterfront. But that's the one thing that we as a group have not yet addressed.
So you're coming from the angle of people changing. Well, I guess just in some of our journeys here, we've met folks 10, 15, 20 years ago that had a specific thought pattern or ideal, or they saw it in a manner. And I guess through a period of reflection or introspect, I guess, if you will, or just trying to educate to have a better understanding, help to move the narrative. And I think often we're not there to convince people, but sometimes we're there to maybe just show them the way. And I say that because often people, foundation is what they were taught. So if what was put into them was not correct, or as it occurred, we know historically, then they will travel with that flaw as a part of that. And I think that's what Dr. Tonya said earlier, then you present to them that you were traveling with a flaw, and here's the documentation, here's the evidence, then sometimes there's an anger that comes up because that you now have told them something that you know to be true, documented to be true, but their grandmother and grandfather said it was otherwise. Now they're conflicted. And so I think to what you said earlier, Dr. Edgar, we have to realize that people can change given the right circumstance and the right environment.
I think that's right, and I think that you're trying to gently lead us to something like the Calhoun Monument, am I? Yeah. In 2015, in April of 2015, I was here in Charleston for an event that marked the end of that 150th anniversary of the Civil War. It was an event at the Dock Street Theater, and there were a bunch of historians on stage, and somebody in the audience asked a question, and they basically said, "What about all these Confederate monuments? What are we going to do?" And I was one of a group of 5 or 6 historians, and we all sort of sighed and said, well, there's something like 2,500 Confederate monuments throughout the region. David Blight was on the panel. He's sort of like the dean of Civil War memory studies. And he said, I just don't think that there's anything that can be done. I mean, more or less, that's what he said. And everybody on stage agreed with him. In other words, here we were, these historians we spend our lives studying historical change over time. But we had this kind of assumption that this commemorative landscape that had been in place for so long was unchangeable. That there's no way that these things would ever go away. And then, of course, things changed pretty rapidly. And so I do think it's possible that if, we continue to show the evidence that we all know to be true, what these monuments stand for, what they represent, why they were put up, people can change their minds. We're not going to convince everyone, but enough people change their mind in Charleston to get that one particular monument down, and that's something, right? That's something.
Well, yes, people do change. And I have been quoted in print as saying in the 1990s that I did not think I would live to see the Confederate flag taken all from in front of the State House. And it happened 7 years ago, but because of a tragedy. But it did happen. And enough people had to be, as Chaz would say, be dragged forward to make it happen, because that was a decision made by political persons who, if you'd taken a poll in South Carolina, the majority of the population would say, leave it up, even after it came down. But it did come down. And I think that was a very powerful, powerful statement. Even if people didn't care that the fact that South Carolina was boycotted, you couldn't have certain athletic contests here in South Carolina because of that flag. You had the basketball coach at Carolina leading a march with Mayor Riley to Columbia to take it down. It didn't get anywhere. So yes, people can change.
People can change, but what we know in South Carolina is that change comes incrementally. We are an incrementalist state.
Well,
And so how do we balance those two things when you can still drive down Calhoun Street? You can still see the monument there. You can still see any number of those thousands of monuments that still exist in Charleston and the rest of the state. What does further change look like in that context?
So if I can take the perspective of a new South Carolinian, because I still have a little bit of my external lens on, when I hear about sort of the Calhoun statue conversation, for me, who not just, but I've been here the shortest, it's a Calhoun-Vesey conversation, right? So if you're here, you're really thinking about the Calhoun statue, and I'm also thinking about the Vesey statue, and they both sort of represent those same conversations, right? So from venerated to, ooh, we gotta rethink this, from terrorist to, ooh, revolutionary. And so we're doing that conversation, and I think what strikes me, and I'm borrowing this phrase from someone else, is that statues are as much about whatever they commemorate as they are about the people who put them up, right? And so that's what sort of changes. And if statues are actually supposed to reflect the people who are putting the statue up, then that I think is part of the approach we have to take. It's not about does the statue or monument reflect the then, it's does it reflect the now, like does it reflect us now, because that's what people see, and that's what people are picking up on. And so the reconsideration, sort of reinterpretation, or even removal, but I'm not big, this might be dangerous, I'm not big on the destruction of statues, removing them, reinterpreting them, putting them somewhere else. Because one of the things I know is that my beloved country has a short memory. And if we erase all of this, will we still remember that there was a time when we believed that this is what we should honor and this is what we should venerate? And that's important for us to know. It's important for us to know that that's where we came out of. Either it's a celebration or it's remembering those things are sticky, kind of might get pulled back. So I have this, I really want to grapple with it, because...
So what does that look like at the museum then? What does that approach look like?
We don't have statues.
Well, I think that the State Museum in Columbia is in talks with the city to get the Calhoun statue, is that correct? And I think that would be potentially a great way to deal with exactly what you're talking about, have the same fear. What does it mean to no longer walk by the Calhoun statue? It's great to no longer walk by the Calhoun statue. But then we lose the fact that it was there for over 100 years and that it had an impact on every person who who walked by day after day after day.
Right.
So I like the idea of a museum acquiring the statue and appropriately contextualizing it so that we can understand what it was. I think kind of more generally, it's important that a part of the history now of the region is the removal and destruction of these statues, so that we treat that as a part of the narrative and that we incorporate that into museum designs, into even potentially signage that's in public spaces.
Yeah.
Would Marion Square be a spot for that? I don't know. But I think that making that a part of the narrative, the fact that there was a lot of conversation after the year 2015 about what these things meant, that they needed to come down, a lot of debate, a lot of contentious argument, I think that that is useful to have now chronicled in all of these places where we record history.
I would add, being a part of the City of Charleston History Commission, we were engaged in a lot of conversation, but John C. Calhoun. And one of the things that I shared and others shared, that we realized that's a part of our American experience. We will all agree here. Maybe not how we see things today in 2022. So when we did vote to move forward and to encourage the city council to move forward, in the back of my mind, I knew at some place in time that it needed to be in some other building where it could be interpreted. You could have an understanding of John C. Calhoun's life, his connectivity to then and as well as to now. And you all may know there was an effort a number of months ago to even have it taken out to California to be a part of a collaborative effort, and I supported that because at the end of the day, I saw that place potentially in California as a place that could talk about this collectively and collaboratively, but that did not materialize. And so it's my understanding that you just shared that there are conversations underway now, perhaps with the State Museum, in which this can still be addressed, taken care of, because at the end of the day, this is something that I think that we as South Carolinians need to know and have an understanding beyond where it once was to how it affects us. Because the reality, words that came out of his mouth over a century and a half ago, in many respects, still dictates the movement of our state even today.
Well, history is complicated. Everybody knows Ben Tillman's not one of my favorite people in history. But everybody says, he's the founder of Clemson University, which he is. He's also the founder of Winthrop University. He's also the founder of South Carolina State University, which is very seldom mentioned. Now, there was a reason that he was the founder of South Carolina State, but it's amazing, anytime something comes out about Ben, they always talk about Clemson. They don't. All of those are part of the same story, an important part of the same story.
I want to go back to something that a few of you alluded to before about the importance of South Carolina, and to ask the broader question, what is it that we have to teach other places, either in the grappling with the complication of our history? What stories do we have to teach the rest of the world, Mr. Allen?
When I began my journey with the Park Service, having some understanding of the connectivity of the Low Country to West Africa.
Yeah.
And I think as I've grown in stature and understanding that narrative, as the pastor shared prior to his prayer, that 40% of all people of color that survived the Middle Passage, that survived that voyage, had the opportunity, whether they wanted it or not, or however that turned out, the first step foot on North American soil, less than 7 or 8 miles from where we're sitting in this edifice tonight. And today, 60 to 70% of all people of color living in the United States can make some connectivity, intersection to those who put footprints on Sullivan's Island. I think just using that, there are other individuals, other activities that we can also lift up as being important to our nation's story. But for me, that was the defining moment of understanding that relationship, but also realizing that was not taught to me. in Williamsburg County between first grade all the way to my senior year in high school. That wasn't presented to me. It wasn't until I was a freshman in college in Dr. Bill Hines' class that one of the books that we utilized is Black Majority by Dr. Peter Wood.
Yeah.
And as I thumbed through the book, not only just for the class and for the grade, I began to see myself in ways that I did not fully understand. Steeped in Gullah history and culture and tradition, but not understanding the full Africanisms that was before me. And so I think these are the tools and the opportunities that we can utilize and say, this is South Carolina and its connectivity to our national story.
We have an influence, I think, beyond something that's formal. Over the years, I have had people from other states, whether they're involved with state historic sites or private sites. How can you all do that in South Carolina? Why did Middleton Place change its narrative? Why did even PRT begin to talk about certain things? We can't get this done in Kentucky. How did y'all do it? So we have people that are looking at us for one reason or another. Usually, what have y'all done lately that's going to be on the international news? But they also understand that South Carolina has a very important place. We really have done some of the things we've done, we have come a long way, and others still would like to even get half where we have. So I think if we it's incremental, yes sir, we keep doing what we're doing, we keep moving, and others will take notice.
And I would sort of bring those two together. I mean, there's clearly this seminal, foundational, African American history and connection, and then there's the things we're doing right now. But actually, between reading your book, Blain, and then all the whispers I'm listening to, if I go to, out to Awandal, Mount Pleasant, and I get part of one story, and I come down to the peninsula, I get the other half. You laugh, and I get the other half of the story. But one of the things that I have sort of picked up, and this is why I think that if anyone can do it, Charleston, the Low Country, South Carolina can, is because from my perspective, we were essentially the madmen of the country. That we are the mistresses, masters, kings, and queens of reinventing the narrative based on whatever is suiting us at the moment, and however we need to retell this story so that we come out sort of on top and that kind of thing. As challenging as some of those rewritten narratives have been, it's an incredible cultural skill set that we have as we think about the reinvention and the retelling sort of these stories. So if there is a community that is culturally predisposed to do this and get this done, I do think it's here. And as I'm sort of in here and I'm trying to learn and understand this culture, I can feel it probably in a way that folks who are born and bred here do very intuitively. And so someone asked me, do you really think that Charleston is really that important? I said, I figured that out in the first 90 days.
Yeah.
Which was yes. It's not just that we are the center and having seminal of the story, is that we have this way of telling and retelling the story to suit the times and the agenda that we're in. And if we continue to think about that, but pointing it in an interesting direction, I think that could be our gift.
And it is appropriate in a place where the Ashley and Cooper rivers come together to form the Atlantic Ocean.
Of course.
Yeah, one other thing, as you were talking about the centrality of Charleston in terms of African American history, the enslaved experience, I think the other thing, this kind of relates to what you were saying, I think the other thing that South Carolina, particularly Charleston, can kind of help us understand is how misinformation and disinformation works. Because white Charlestonians were masters of falsifying the historical record and being propagandists. And it's important, as we all know, in the year 2022, to be paying attention to the stories that are being told in whatever venue we're talking about, whether it's history or politics. And so I think there's a lot to learn from how these stories were covered up and manipulated and whitewashed and falsified. I think that's another lesson that Charleston and South Carolina can teach us.
Thank you. And so I want to start at the end and hear from each of you on this question. A lot of what you have mentioned during this conversation has reminded me of the poem A New Day Dawns by Nikki Finney, which she wrote in the aftermath of the lowering of the flag. There's a beautiful video on the state's website that you can check out. But she asks the recurring question, who are we now? And when we think of that with regard to Charleston and South Carolina, how do you answer that question? Who are we now?
I think as to where we are now in 2022, in some respects, I think some of the gains that we have been involved in and engaged with over the last decade or two is under serious threat. I'm at a place and point in my life now where I've seen some of the successes that have come through changing the atmosphere and the landscape, but I see folks that are coming in to take advantage of the change that we work so hard to build. And so that's a concern that I have now, that people are appropriating the good history that we have moved forward on in an effort to still say they're shaping the narrative. I probably didn't see that 10, 15, 20 years ago, but I feel that now. And so when I do have an opportunity, I say it very publicly. So I think that we're on a good trajectory in terms of dealing with the hard things. I can say to you, Dr. Matthews, I'm grateful for January 21st of hopefully of next year, because I had the good fortune of sitting in the first board meeting 21 years ago for that museum, and didn't really understand why I was in the room in some respects, even though I was asked to come. And then a part of some of us in there say, is this really going to come to pass? And back then it was only $40 million, not what you have to deal with now. So I say that to say this, I think we're on a good place. Yes, there are enemies at the gate, but I think for me and others that are standing and sitting here and in this room, you have to be confident in yourself. And I think when you are, that gives you the capacity to overcome things that may come up against you.
Thank you.
So I think one of the important distinctions or developments to keep in mind that makes this moment different from, say, 100 years ago is that now all of the stakeholders have a voice. When the Calhoun monuments, plural, went up, because remember there was one in 1887 and then it was replaced by the larger one in 1896, African Americans were in the process of being disenfranchised. And by 1896, because of the 1895 Constitution, whites had successfully disenfranchised the vast majority of African Americans in South Carolina. And so a lot of the decisions that were made, the statues that went up, the sites that were preserved, the stories that were told there, these decisions were made only by a certain group of people. And so I think that now, here we are 100 years later, and because of the social and political revolutions, of the mid to late 20th century, at the very least, if we're not in a perfect place yet, at least all of the stakeholders theoretically have a voice. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the city is promoting a more collaborative approach to the decisions that are being made about what to talk about what sites matter and what stories to tell.
Thank you.
I think for me, I'm wondering, while I get excited by the lowering of the flag, I'm thinking, well, yeah, we also won the war, and then we're talking about the flag, and so part of me is also trying to grapple with sort of the visual and the celebrations and making sure we don't forget. And so right now, I think who we are, sort of similar to what you're saying, but taking it in a slightly different direction, is I think we are a people who is drunk with the power of the ability to tell my own story, right? So we now have the ability to tell my story. That song, you have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story. The first two parts are true, but the last one certainly is no longer true, right? Now you have control because you can tell your own story. And so my question is, if we're drunk off of that power, who is going to have the courage to tell our story, right? So that's the thing. Now that we all have the power to individualize our story and prioritize our own particular perspectives, who among us will be brave enough to step forward and sort of tell our story? And I think that's what we're looking at. I think right now who we are is a whole bunch of folks standing in a ring, and we're looking at our story right in there, saying, are you going in there? I don't know if I'm going. Are you going in there, Edgar? I don't know if I'm going in there. And so, but I think that's a good thing, right? I do think that is a good thing, because to your point, it's not, you know, 3 people in a room deciding what story is going to come out. And so that is kind of what I see in this new space where we all have our own voice. We are being challenged to step in and try to figure out how to make the our out of the you and the I. And so I think that's what has me excited, and I think that is a large part you know, that I'm hoping that the museum plays, and not just telling the history, but making space for such conversations.
Thank you. Dr. Edgar.
I think telling stories, everybody being able to tell their story openly, and what Charleston's doing, it's not just confined to Charleston. It's happening in Columbia, it's happening in Florence, it's happening in Greenville, places that 25 years ago, it would not have happened. It would not have happened. So I am hopeful for the future. The state motto, while I breathe, I hope. What we need to do is to make sure everyone is prepared in mind and resources to be able to move forward.
Yeah. The writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, in her talk, The Danger of a Single Story, talks about a balance of stories. And what I'm hearing from you all is a need for a balance of stories, the
Yes.
complicating factors that don't just tell one truth, but tell many, many facets and versions of that truth for others.
South Carolina history is nuanced.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to remember.
So please join me in thanking our panelists.